we start the next session, which is about food and agriculture. So you have the floor.
Bonjour à tous, je suis Jean-Christophe Debar, directeur de la Fondation Farm.
I am Jean-Christophe Debar, director of FARM, which is the Foundation for World Agriculture and Rurality in the World, which is in Montrouge, Paris. I have with me two distinguished experts in agriculture and nutrition, and for sub-Saharan Africa, I would be tempted to say Lionel Gbaguidi. He is the director of a study unit which is called Agrivet, which is expert in animal husbandry especially, and which is based in Benin and Cotonou. And then Albert Sasson, and I'd be tempted to say for North Africa overall. He has a considerable responsibility, therefore, Mr. Sasson, and he's going to talk about a few examples, especially with regard to this region, and in particular, success stories, because there are success stories of small-time agriculture in the challenge that we have of how to feed growing urban populations. Now, to introduce this debate, I'd like to give you some background and some key points. In other words, to say something which is quite obvious, but we're going to illustrate it, this enormous challenge we face. And in fact, there is great food insecurity, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, because according to official FAO figures, it is thought that 1/4 of the sub-Saharan African population doesn't eat enough, and in the MENA countries it's about 10%, but there are regional variations which are in fact quite evident. Second point is that generally Africa, North Africa or sub-Saharan Africa imports increasing amount of food. If we look at net imports, the difference between imports and exports, and we express this as a percentage of overall food consumed in kilocalories, what do we have? In the North African, MENA and Middle East countries, it's very high, 40%. It's a bit lower in sub-Saharan Africa, but it's still about 15%. And what should be underlined is that there will be and is very considerable food dependency. These are quite visible. If you spend in food for food on the international markets, because if you have to import, you in fact have to submit to the vagaries of the market, and of course that means risk of indebtedness for the state if you don't have enough foreign currency to pay for this food, and then also that means that there's a very real danger. Now, this is a really big challenge, because when you think about the next 30-40 years, what we see or forecast is an increase in food requirements in Africa in general, from the north to the south. The first thing, obviously, is because of the demographic explosions. According to the United Nations agencies, between 2015 and 2050, there will be 1.3 billion people on the African continent, more than double, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. we will see this increase, but also in the North Africa and Middle East countries. We expect to see about 60% increase in population. The second factor is urbanization. About 40% of the population lives in towns in the continent of Africa. This is increasing very rapidly. In 2050, about 60% of the population should probably be living in cities. And linked in with this urbanization, but also because of the increased lifestyles of certain people, and that's a good thing, there will be a change in dietary habits, which will mean that more animal produce will be used and eaten, and that's especially meat and dairy produce, and that means that you have to produce more plants to feed these animals. And in parallel, a certain number of constraints are going to increase. Climate change that we're speaking a lot of now, and also the fact that water resources in many regions is becoming rarer, but also the subject of keen competition between the various categories of the population. And then we have the energy issue when you think about agricultural production and the processing of agricultural produce. And FARM and Production Agritique, which is another association I'm working, has been in fact working with INRA, and especially with regard the North Africa, Middle East area, in these areas, to try and see what the food dependency of this area is, and as of 2050, how this in fact would develop. And also we try to estimate, again, there's a lot of uncertainties there, but try to estimate the effect of all this on climate change and the effect it would have also on agricultural production. Now, you can see the results on the INRA site, but this area of Northern Africa, in fact, is dependent in terms of 40% of its food requirement, and I'm talking about all food, not just cereals, as is often the case with statistics. And if you don't take into account the climate change, but just the population change, this dependency would go from 40 to 50% as of 2050. And if you include climate change, it goes to 55%. These are just figures that illustrate the situation, but we don't want to be too alarming, but obviously this sort of result calls for action. There are some reasons for being optimistic, or at least to put together a series of solutions. And in fact, Africa has an enormous production potential. It has a lot of land available and water. And also, when it comes to agricultural land, we tend to exaggerate this a bit for a series of reasons I won't go into. But technically and statistically, however, Africa would seem to have a lot of free land which is not yet under till. But a lot of this land is used by animal breeders, for example, and therefore it's not really free. And if you put it over to arable land, there'll be problems for others. And also you have ecosystems like forests that you want to preserve. And very often these sorts of lands are counted as arable land, but can't really be used. But anyway, there's a certain not negligible margin of maneuver. But the greatest margin of maneuver, I think, is with regard to incomes and yields. And in fact, we talk about very, very low yields in Africa. That's where we start from. And if you express food production in terms of kilocalories per hectare, hectare, 1 hectare produces about, in Africa, 3 times less calories in sub-Saharan Africa than it does in Asia. It's a very indicative, very rough yardstick, but in fact, often we're below that. But the good thing about that is that if, as very often is not the case today, we get to give credit to agriculture, and we'll come back to that idea of giving credit. If we can mechanize, if we can irrigate, as has been done in Asia and so on. In other words, a lot more than we do today. And in fact, if we were to irrigate, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, as is not the case now, if all these things were galvanized and were able to reach the farming population, well, then one could very considerably increase yields. And then there's the whole question of post-harvest losses. We know that we lose 20, 30, 40% of the harvest, of all sorts of harvest, cereals, vegetables, fruit, and so on. And there's a lot to be done, and not much has been done. So I'd like to conclude with a couple of remarks. First of all, as far as I see it, this policy of feeding the population, especially urbanized population, there are 2 key issues, probably more, but I would put the accent on 2. The first is that one has to modernize agriculture. And I know that this is a term which is not used and perhaps has certain negative connotations, but I'm going to use it. You have to modernize, as Africa itself wants to modernize its agriculture. At the same time, we know that in the next 20, 30 years, the rural population, despite the growing urbanization, despite the growing urbanization rate, the rural population, including the active farming population, is also going to increase. So one could fear, and we've seen this in the last couple of years, that we see a reduction in the average farm. So what do we have to do? We have to modernize, we have to enlarge the farms, and some statisticians say, okay, 20, 30% or more of the agricultural people in agriculture have to leave the land and go elsewhere so that farms can grow and become more profitable. But talking and thinking about youth employment, as we talked of this morning, that's not an easy thing to actually put into practice. Obviously, there are job opportunities in the supply chain if you're going to introduce processing and so on, but that has yet to be done. The second point, a delicate point that I'd like to underline, is that it's not sufficient just to say how much should we produce and how should we produce it. The question is who's going to produce it. In fact, in Africa, generally, we're dealing with a farming population of which 80%, if not more than the active farming population, lives on farms of less than 12 hectares. So we're talking, and they consume most of what they grow. And this population, which lives on a farm of less than 2 hectares, I beg your pardon, probably, in fact, can't make excess, and they just, it would hardly be likely that they could have jobs outside of their farming work. But if we were to put in practice good public policies and also have private investment, probably these small farms could, in fact, meet the challenge on the condition they have access to land, to credit, which is still very difficult. It's incredible to see how much the agricultural bank sector in Africa has never probably talked about or even really knows about agriculture. Very little credit is given to farmers. So if we were to be able to put these policies in place, probably the small farms would be able to meet the growing demands a bit better. So we have a triple challenge, which is all intertwined, that of food security, which can't really be detached from the whole question of poverty, starting from the fact that most poor people are in the rural area, and then we have the challenge of employment, because active population movements between sectors is, of course, highly important and affects employment. And then, of course, we have the challenge, and we see this in the papers every day, we have the challenge of not just security of food, poverty and employment, but also that of overall security, because people who can't make a living in their own country are very much pushed and tempted to take chance their arm and go to other regions and other continents of the world. So I've painted the backdrop, if you like. I think I've underlined several points. I'd like to ask Lionel right away, at least to talk about one point. I said before that you were specialist in animal husbandry, because, again, as I said, in this region of Africa, as in all developing countries, and Africa is therefore very much concerned, there's the question in the increase in the consumption of animal products. We'll come back to that. But first of all, could you react with regard to the whole question of access to land? And you probably have all heard this question of land grabbing. And in fact, foreign companies, but it's not quite so simple. People come to invest in the African continent and they set up, and directly or indirectly, in fact, they oust the small holders, and there's a process of land grabbing. Have you seen this? Have you got any examples? Is it that? Do I sum up the situation, or is it a bit more complex than that? Thank you very much. It is a bit more complex. It's a phenomenon which, in fact, in the last few years, it has grown, especially because of the crisis. Farming has become a very interesting investment, and its investment in the land is a sure investment. But, however, not all the promises have been fulfilled, so there's been some difficulty actually in the field. The ideas were there, but in the case of Kenya, of Ethiopia, and so on, after these firms and farms, large farms, modern farms were installed with agricultural mechanization and so on, not always did they fare very well. In a country like Benin, there was, in fact, mobilization of the civil society, and farmer associations, in fact, opposed this, and that did influence policy somewhat. But I think that now everybody has understood that things have to, in fact, be changed a bit, and there has to be a legal framework for all this to also encourage investment, because, yes, it's true, land is available, and, yes, we must exploit this land better, but we have to be careful on several fronts, because there is the whole question of growth internally that has to be looked after. We have an increase in the population, urbanization, which is going on, and we have to have land for that. So we have to take all this into account before we are sure that, in fact, we can have these investments without there being detrimental use. Is it sure whom the land belongs to? Yeah, that's also a problem as well, because in certain environments, the actual confines of land are not well defined. Property is not well defined. And as there wasn't a great deal of pressure on these land, people lived quite in harmony, and conflicts were resolved simply. But when you've got somebody coming from outside of Benin wants to buy and enclose and want to establish the actual property that he owns, well, in fact, old conflicts then came to the fore, which had previously been frozen because many villages and ethnic groups, in fact, all these things came to the surface, and there was considerable conflict. Whereas before, the problem really didn't come about. And in the Millennium Challenge, in fact, tried to open up these properties and to take stock of the tenure system. The producer organizations, in fact, however, would not for that, because they thought that land, in fact, was not being indicated as having the right proprietors and owners. And that is also a question of people who use the land as pasture. Now, when you... Now, let's come to animal production in Africa, but not just in Africa. In fact, we're seeing the increase. If we look at animal production today in sub-Saharan Africa, it's considerable in Benin and other examples. Is the situation of animal husbandry and also dairy production, can it, or can this sort of production meet the growing demands? No. Well, but I try to give you a bit of backdrop to that, talking about the increase in animal products. In fact, we've seen the appearance of the middle class, people with higher revenues, and therefore, as a result, people want better quality food. People want to have a balanced diet, more diverse diet, and a quality food diet, not only from a nutritional point of view, but also from a health point of view, and safety. So the direct production being gone from the field to the table and the fork is something which, in fact, is waning. And now with the growing urban population, people want to have a well-presented product and they want to have it standardized. So we have to think about that. The second thing is that, and we talked of this morning, women increasingly working, they live longer and pass more time outside of their home, and therefore they can't deal with everything with regard to household work and preparing food. So as a result, we have an increasing amount of catering sector producing food outside of their home, and that contributes to improve the situation. But to go back to your question of production and its capacity, what we see is that, taking the example of meat, it was a pastoral system, and this pastoral animal husbandry system required, of course, pasture land and so on. And today, of course, then we have that issue now of property and land ownership. So this is increasingly a difficult thing. There are difficulties in keeping this up and increasing the production. So national policies, in fact, now have gone towards going and having stables and. But does it work? No. In fact, it has posed a problem. So we have the whole question of the type of production. But we have two systems now. We have a mixed system, agriculture plus animal husbandry, animal rearing. And very often it's the farmers themselves who, in fact, use farming as well so that they can recycle some of their waste. And then we have an increase in poultry and in pig farming. And these, especially poultry and pigs, are the most likely to be able to meet the urban needs. Even if we have question of competition between man and animals because we use the same or eat the same sort of food like white cereals and so on. Men eat the same cereals as animals. And of course, here we're going to have to work at a solution for that. And a couple of figures to show you the extent of the problem. In the 2000-2030, we think that the 112% has been the increase in beef, and also poultry and eggs have gone up by 107, 170%, and so on. So we've had an enormous increase, and therefore the challenge is equally large. Now, let me go to Albert Sasson, North Africa, Middle East. Well, I talked about this a little bit before. In fact, we have perhaps very much this question of food dependency. These small farms, these small holders, the small and average-sized holdings, how can they be part of the solution? Because very often we consider them as a social problem, and we've got to sooner or later get rid of these small holders, even if they employ and give a living to many, many people. What do you think about this, Albert? Thank you. Now, as I'm taking the floor for the first time in these round tables, I would like to give my respects to Robert Clapiche for his certain stubbornness and his drive in keeping these meetings up, and there are not many of us, and in fact he has pushed a great deal for this, and it warms my heart to be able to come here and talk about problems which are really serious today, very grave problems in the true sense of that word. Now, Jean-Christophe, I think, has given us the backdrop very accurately. I don't think that we can contradict what he says, except in just a few details. Now, in this region on the north of the Sahara Desert, which we tend to forget, because when we talk about Africa, we always think of Lomé, Abidjan, and we leave out Northern Africa. But Northern Africa is certainly there with its specific characteristics. In fact, we have had a shared history also in the agricultural field, and that's why I insist on this. And today, in the UN classification, we're talking about MENA, and that is Middle East and North Africa, and which goes from Morocco to Jordan and even a bit further. Also, the Gulf countries, but they, in fact, are already on the other side, if you like, not always included. Unfortunately, this is a region that, as has been said, that depends enormously on food imports. It doesn't mean that they are not trying not to, but we have seen also changes, and we've also seen global warming. And in Morocco, in fact, they know this, and for the last 50 years, we've seen very clearly that we've had more erratic rains. Very often they have not been good. Like we've had excellent years, we've had 115 million tons of cereal in terms of the harvest, which was an exceptional year. And despite this, we are nonetheless still going to import wheat, soft wheat. And Egypt also imports a lot. 120 tons, in fact, is going to be delivered by France to Egypt because Egypt's hungry. And also in 2008, the riots in Egypt, in fact, brought everybody out onto the street because of the price of bread, and the army's bakeries, in fact, were made to work and give the bread to the people to try and calm the riots. The chief of the state of Niger said, in fact, that food security just means food security full stop, which means that there is a danger. People can die, not just of hunger, but because they're going to be attacked, because the bakery shops will be pillaged and their produce stolen. So we have a production of 25 million tons. But that means that things don't really improve. So we have to import, and we have to pay for these imports. We're not all very solvent either. But some people, in fact, pay them not very well, and others pay them quite well. We pay for them quite well because, in fact, we export and get export currency. We export olives, oil, and so on, so we can compensate. But nonetheless, we have a considerable deficit. So we are a vulnerable area, vulnerable vis-à-vis what's happening in the planet. We, in fact, don't create a lot of greenhouse gases because we don't pollute. But we have to, in fact, bear the weight of this nonetheless. And also, however, we don't produce enough, that we have to import, and therefore we become indebted. And our population is growing up, even if, in fact, the MENA countries, in fact, the population has gone down compared to others. In Morocco, we're in a transition period. Certainly, there are people that still have 5, 6 kids, but in the town, people have not more than 2 children because children cost a lot. So there is awareness now in our country, especially in the urban areas. There are obviously solutions, and we should speak in the plural. What is called family subsistence, small-time farming, which is that of a family with a couple of people, and they have one domestic animal with an old cart, and that's how they farm. This family agriculture represents 2.5 billion people in the world, and it's 85% of the farmers. So it's not nothing. And it, in fact, includes about 60%, it nourishes 60% of the population very often in the cities, because these family farms are around the large cities. In Brazil, for example, Lula da Silva has the famous recipe where he combined they improved things with regard to seeds, animals, and so on, but also they increased the ability of the farmers and also gave more money to the family, to the woman, not the man who might spend it. And this was done on the condition that the children would go to school, would be vaccinated, and so on. So they combined the two aspects, the farming aspect and also the social aspect. That's, in fact, how it should be done. And in Morocco, we try and do both, not just to improve agriculture and farming, but from a social point of view, protect the farming family more. Now, to stay with a country, which is mine, that I know best, in Morocco, we practically, out of 1.5 million farms, not a lot, because Morocco is twice France. It's 1 million square meters, but in the middle there's a huge desert. I mean, it's of no use. So when we are, people in fact talk to us about land grabbing, well, there's nothing to grab. And if there are emirs of the Gulf who came, well, they come in fact to buy this land, to hunt the falcon, or to build an airport which is private. I mean, they don't grab land in our country. But unfortunately, we can't find any oil in this area. So we have to go for family farming, and that's what we're doing. The plan that we have developed is going to go to 2020, and there are two pillars. One pillar where we have the large holdings, and they produce, well, they're the ones that produce oranges, tomatoes, olive oil, and so on. And then we have the second pillar, which again, as I say, is family farming. And 750,000 farms. Well, we're trying to group them together to create cooperatives or clusters. And if you do that, you change things fundamentally. In the northwest of Morocco, in Tangier, which is the region of Lucos, we have transformed cereal growers, which was an extensive, poor sort of farming, to, in fact, produce fruit and bread and strawberries and so on. Now, what have they done, these people? They had land available because they would farm cereal. There was water because it rains a bit more there, and therefore they could irrigate. They opened up to technology thanks to cooperation with Spain, because in fact the Camarosa, the famous strawberry, is very, very much a Spanish product, and this was done in Huelva. And with cooperation with the Spains, they did joint ventures to, in fact, go for the European market and export to Europe, and 17,000 families, in fact, are in this area and doing this sort of thing. Of course, it does create jobs because it gives technicians and so on, and that really did work. Another thing is the palm groves. Just think that Morocco got to a stage when it imported dates because all our palm groves had been devastated by a mushroom, which was a pathogen, which destroyed the palm groves. But we have found tolerant, not resistant, but tolerant varieties. So these have to be developed in vitro. The test tube palm tree, a date tree, in fact, is the solution. And these gradually are being introduced so that we can reproduce the famous date, which is called the fat grape. And in fact, it is called fat because when you open it up, there's a little piece of skin which is white, and it looks as if it's fat, but it's not. It's a magnificent variety of date. And this is now being done, and and saffron. We are very, very far from Iran, which is number one producer. We have 500 hectares in a region of the center-south, the Talirid, which is a protected area. We want to go to 2,000 hectares thanks to our farmers. We got people to come back from Casablanca, back to their area. And usually we have the flight from the land, and we're trying to get them to come back. People have come back because they see that they can earn a living. And saffron, which is called the yellow gold, is very expensive. But in fact, we are doing this in a different way. Research, which is important. You know that it's a bulb with a pretty flower. And we reproduce it. It has to be selected, and there are varieties which have, in fact, 4 stigmata. So you have to use these because you can produce 4 times more. The stigmata, in fact, is the end of the pistilla, and that's what where the saffron comes from. And therefore, and you have that fantastic color, and very often, again, saffron as a product is also subject to considerable fraud because of this. So these are a couple of examples that show that it is possible, it can be done. As long as you cluster people, as long as you improve access to water, irrigation, drop-by-drop irrigation is no longer a question of flood irrigation, drip irrigation, and the best drip irrigation possible, and you can pay for that. And then there's the social aspect, the social supply chain, if you like, which is all important, and the Moroccan state, and the state is all important, and that's important. The state, people are convinced and that there's a certain ethic of responsibility, and this is shown by the conviction on the part of the Moroccan state that even if we have all the other questions, agriculture is a priority sector, and in fact because it employs 60% of the population. And this conviction on the part of the Morocco state, the 2003 Maputo Declaration says that at least 10% of the national budget of African states should, the African states should dedicate 10% to agriculture, and in fact Ethiopia did this. So, and we are convinced of this as well. So this is the stage at which we are at.
I'd like really to agree with what Albert is saying, especially concerning Morocco. And we already spoke about Morocco this morning. And this Morocco plan, Green Morocco plan, for instance, countries like Senegal or other countries still, Gabon, for instance, who is seeking inspiration there as well, and maybe some others. And what's very relevant, I'd say, on the basis of what you are saying, that there be the willingness to do so, and that there is, in fact, a partnership with the private sector that is ready to invest. And I'm tempted to say that maybe for once this is really something serious, and quite evidently something goes on, and this something is positive. Moreover, we are able to say that that's farming and agriculture that has been neglected to a great extent, especially a small-scale and medium-scale agriculture. If it is able to produce and produce well, and then if research products are disseminated, that can certainly bring about results. I think we still have maybe 10 minutes or so, 15 minutes for our debate, maybe to steal a bit some of these minutes of the next session.
On attend vos questions.
In other words, we are waiting for your questions now.
Robert.
Robert,
Non, le micro arrive.
you'll have a mic.
Bon, alors, moi, quand j'étais
Well,
gosse,
as for
pendant la
me,
guerre,
when I was a
il y avait, comme
kid
vous savez,
during
à
the
peu près
war,
50%
some
de la population
50% of the population were
were
farmers, actually. And then there was exodus as well as social transformation that took place. And now, obviously, the percentage is not the same. In terms of farming, the population has gone down. However, in terms of the agricultural networks, this is not the case. There has been this transformation. There is also the question of services. You were saying what you were saying about women and so forth, that wouldn't like to spend so much more time in this anymore. And what Morocco is doing is really quite admirable, because like in France, for instance, because there is electrification of rural regions going on, and that is why the ODF was created in France. And then Morocco also is doing something similar. There is also subcontracting in this area, and this seems to be working well. Then I think we should also be thinking in terms of agriculture. And you spoke also about losses.
Ça implique également des routes.
What that implies, obviously, is the necessary road network when it comes to distribution of products and everything else. Obviously, we are aware that this is still not sufficient. And then yet another question, cooperatives. And we do know, for instance, especially in emergency cases, for instance, in terms of harvesting and so forth, because sometimes harvesting is indeed carried out at the right moment. And also what we have to bear in mind is climate change and so forth. And we need to be able to feed the urban populations, growing urban populations. Therefore, what Morocco is doing is admirable. However, things should not remain static, and in the future we'll still have to do more. And not all agriculture and services, they are quite certainly something that can contribute to the growth of jobs.
Comme ça, on prend les deux questions et on vous laisse.
Okay.
Maybe we can take two more questions. This year, when I was invited by the Moroccan agricultural credit, Crédit Agricole, and I was invited to one of the largest African fairs in this area. And we noticed that obviously one of the major, especially the most important problems are quite certainly credits, loans. And in Senegal, for instance, to a certain extent, they've been able to resolve the problem. But on the other hand, in fact, it also takes adapting on the part of the population. And there is indeed this green plan in Morocco. And today, wherever you go in Morocco, and I must say that in fact I experience this every weekend when I go to my village in Debar, a small village, and you need an advisor, you need a technologist who was trained for the job. You also need a loan to buy a tractor. That's my own personal experience, and it is all one shop, and 25 to 30% of the loan, in fact, is given by the state. And I was contacted by young people. 9 young people came to me because they wanted a loan, but they were in fact illiterate. They could neither read or write. And I suggested, I left a piece of paper with one of these young people, and then he came on the Monday afterwards, and then we received the answer from Cosima and so forth, because that is what it all boils down to when we speak about cooperatives. And that was a loan to, in fact, grow crops. And all this should be part and parcel of a long-term strategy, I'd say. And in that case, it can be operational. Thank you. Well, on these two questions and these comments, and probably we can revert back to these questions. But what Robert was saying, there is this pressing need for networks, networking. To start with, in order to, in fact, contribute to the good understanding of the whole problem. And if we think that agriculture, actually it's only the 300,000 farms that contribute to the agriculture production, this is one thing, but in reality, upstream, for instance, and downstream, there is also this whole economics, we could say, of it all, of the agricultural chain. There is, for instance, on the input side, on the output side, and so forth. And through research as well. And this is not, it doesn't represent 3% of the population. I'd say that seen in this light, we can speak about 15% of the population. And that is, I think that in that case, we're able to measure the importance of agriculture more or less in all countries. About the loans, I suppose that you wanted to come back to this question. Well, even the question of this chain and its value, and within this chain of supply. Well, when we speak of dates, for instance, are these natural dates or some other type of dates? And then when we do this and try to define it, we see that the number of farmers then is much greater. And then also agricultural farming funding. This is what becomes, in fact, the whole question. And there are perhaps also farmers who do not have the necessary guarantees and so forth. Those, however, who contribute to the transformation, to the processing, it's another matter, because some people have their own plants, and the banks will rather finance those people. And in order to guarantee, for instance, the rice supply in this particular case. Therefore, there are the different relations that you should base yourself on, and that should be, in that case, can be, in fact, a powerful leverage to use. And furthermore, more can be done to reduce financing risks in agriculture. Well, insurance, on the point of insurance, well, that's something that also needs to be further developed. And the farmers that benefit from such funding in order to be protected against, for instance, drought or some other occurrences of this type. And I'd also like to say, for instance, the representative of the African Development Bank this morning concluded more or less by saying that so far, for instance, there is the cocoa chain exporting, for instance, the gross product and so forth, as is the case of chocolate in the case of Switzerland. Well, she is not here, but I'd still like to say it. For the first time, I know that this is something that she presented as a good result. We do know that there is production of cocoa in Ivory Coast. And you can bet that, in fact, you will come across these tablets presently. Back in the 60s, for instance, it was, and I must say that this is a colonial expression, la filière cacao, or, for instance, a forest channel in a way, because you had a farm, then there were correspondents in France, and so forth. And this is IRSH. And then it became SIAD. There were changes, as these changes were also internal changes. In other words, you take into consideration all different stages. And for instance, now they will tell you that this is, for instance, the cocoa channel is not something that complements the coffee, what's done in the area of coffee.
Transformation des produits sur place. Nous, les dattes, on les exporte pas bruts, et les Algériens non plus, et les Tunisiens non plus. Ils les mettent.
In other words, this is how it works, and it all depends also on the variety, and some of the varieties are real flagships. And at the level of palm groves, for instance, or oases, there are some very poor people living there. However, this is increasingly becoming a supply chain. And all this stems still from the colonial times. In Morocco and Tunisia, we had lived under a protectorate. There were colons, and they had the best land. And there was the useful Morocco and the other part of Morocco. And this land was then redistributed. And when we think, for instance, about the olive groves and this production, however, although this is not the best olive oil, however, it is there. Not like in Italy, but you can easily compare it to the Spanish olive oil. And they rank third in the world. In other words, progress has been made in this area and in this farming. However, we are still with a dual model, the big landowners on the one hand and the small ones on the other. And then there is also the role of cooperatives. So, mentally speaking, we are still colonized, we could say.
Allez-y.
Très rapide, madame, s'il vous plaît, parce que...
Very quickly, please. We will have to conclude. I'd like to switch it off. Well, there are farmers, and these farmers are scattered. And this is what you were saying. And I was able to be involved with one group in a poor community. where they wanted to develop the production of carpets, carpet production, and this particular craft. So that is how this was organized.
Heureusement s'arrêter là pour des raisons de temps, mais avant de finir, j'aimerais.
We are short of time. However, to go along with what Albert was saying early on, and Lionel as well, I'd like to, first of all, wish a good anniversary to this foundation, Sharing Knowledge Foundation. And when it comes to food production, obviously speaking about food, we seem all to agree. However, whenever there is question of these other aspects, in some respects it may appear archaic. But I think we can only welcome the fact that agriculture is coming back. Thank you.